It's with great pleasure that I warmly welcome you to this panel discussion on the evolution of terrorist groups. I'm very, very honored and delighted to moderate this session and to have with us today two very distinguished panelists. Firstly, Professor Audrey Kerf Cronin, a distinguished professor in the School of International Service and director of the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology at American University. Her latest book, Power to the People, How Open Technological Innovation is Arming Tomorrow's Terrorists, published by Oxford University Press 2020, is certainly something to look out for. And secondly, Dr. Tim Wilson, a trustee of Airey Neave Trust and director of the Handa Center for Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews. And his latest book, also fascinating, Killing Strangers, How Political Violence Became Modern. And this appeared in September 2020. It's actually timely that we take on this topic. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks of 11 September, and the impact of 9/11 has been global. In my own region, Southeast Asia, on 9/11 itself, we had the Jemaah Islamiyah terror group, which had a common ideology and direct links with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And they were already in advanced planning for simultaneous truck bomb attacks on multiple targets in Singapore before 9/11 happened. And these targets included the US Embassy and other Western interests. A year after 9/11, and I was in New York on that day, the Southeast Asian Jemaah Islamiyah terrorists detonated bombs on the tourist island of Bali, killing 202 people of 22 nationalities. And the attacks in my region didn't stop there. So clearly, the greatest danger that came in a very multi-religious, multiracial religion, and now in our globalized world, was to mutual trust and social cohesion. And this was basically exploited by the terror groups. And the threat landscape has evolved, and many serious terror incidents since then. And more recently, the evolving situation in Afghanistan has been said to provide fertile conditions for transnational terror groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State to regroup. Radicals from my own region are also inspired to travel to these breeding grounds, as it were, to take up arms. Now, I think the two wonderful panelists that we have today are well equipped because they have the whole, I would say, they've understood the whole history and the whole of terror groups and their technique, by me, and pose a question: how political violence became modern, have changed over time, how they've evolved. In particular, one of the book's central claims, as I read it, is that political violence has become impersonal, anonymized, and democratized. Could you share with us a little bit, just to kick us off in this discussion, on your views on how this perspective and this analysis impacts today's terrorism landscape and the way we approach counterterrorism? Over to you, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this invitation to speak and for referencing my book so kindly and generously. I mean, I think really what we're seeing here is an acceleration of trends that go some way back into the past. And that's not to say we're not living in a fast changing world, but I think it is important to understand the continued momentum of processes that have started a way back. I think really, I would sort of make a couple of claims really. I think there's, in some ways, actually states are stronger. It often doesn't seem so, but in many parts of the world, I think states are stronger than they have been in the distant past. It's actually very, very difficult to wage a sustained terrorist campaign of any length and duration against a well-resourced state. That tends to sort of squeeze oppositional violence into certain hit and run forms that we tend to call terrorism. But I think then perhaps most obviously, and Professor Cronin's written with enormous distinction and insight on this, there is, of course, the opportunities and incentives afforded by the particularly technological changes in communication and the way that that has really incentivized a series of tactics that perhaps wouldn't have made so much sense even a few generations back. So to perhaps to just give a sort of example, off the cuff, but the rise of vehicle ramming attacks is something that I find very curious. We've had mass ownership automobile societies, certainly in North America, for about 100 years. But the sort of real global spread of using trucks and cars as an actual weapon in their own right is really very recent. It's really only just about the last 10 years or so that that's really got going. That's something that needs to be explained. I think there's several reasons for that. But I think one of them, frankly, is that we have streets now full of camera phones. So there's a sort of, one can conduct actually relatively primitive attacks and have a good chance that it will be very well recorded.
Well, thank you very much. And let's not, of course, forget aeroplanes, which is how this all started, and flight simulators, and 9/11. I wanted to throw open this question to Professor Cronin, and thank you for mentioning technology, Dr. Wilson. Professor Cronin, your book on Power to the People, how open technological innovation is arming tomorrow's terrorists, argues that any form of technology, including social media, drones, and smartphones, are double-edged swords. And you look historically at the place of dynamite in the 19th century, and then even the simple Kalashnikov weapon. And you say these are all double-edged swords, but you talk more recently about how the internet can be, and technologies of today can be misappropriated to facilitate political violence, mobilization, or terrorist mobilization. For the benefit of those who haven't yet read their books, could you share with us some key insights on how you think this problem plays out and how this proliferation of disruptive technologies that undermine our security and stability, how these can be contained? And we can talk a little bit more about this later and get Dr. Wilson's views as well.
I'd be delighted. Thank you very much. And thank you also for inviting me to participate in this distinguished panel. Yes, in my book, I was very interested in trying to answer the question, how have technologies been used in the past, particularly at a period of open technological innovation, which the late 19th century was? How have technologies been used by terrorists, and what kind of knowledge can that give us? What kind of insight can that give us into how they're being used today and likely to be used tomorrow? So yes, I began with dynamite. Dr. Wilson has a brilliant argument about the introduction of modern terrorism. And so I was also going back to that moment. And to me, I think the introduction of modern terrorism was very much intertwined with the invention of dynamite. So the most common and most often recorded technologies from the 19th century to the present have been dynamite and firearms, and the AK-47's introduction in 1947 was a key reason why we had the second big surge of global terrorism and insurgency because of the symbolism of that particular firearm and the use of assault weapons. So what I was trying to figure out was what sorts of characteristics of technologies made those particular technologies and many others spread very easily. And I found that being driven by commercial processes was very important. Their accessibility to individuals and the ability to use them simply, their sort of consumer friendliness, they're transportable, they were concealable, they were effective. So there was leverage when dynamite was used during that period from about 1867 into the early 20th century. People spoke of dynamite psychosis. So the ability of a particular technology to be in itself a vehicle that gains a symbolism and a kind of an importance in and of itself is something that is vital to the use of technologies. So what we're seeing today is that most of our democratized technologies, both our means of communication, which is one key element in any global wave of terrorism on the one hand, and then also lethal gadgets, lethal technologies themselves. Secondly, those two things together today are uniquely dangerous. And digital communications alongside things like 3D printing, quadcopters, simple autonomy, and the combining of clusters of digital technologies means that we're in another period of extraordinarily surging violence and use of technology going forward, I would argue. So the three things that I've seen changing in about the last I don't know, 20 years, would be first, the ability to mobilize, radicalize, and recruit individuals through those democratized technologies, particularly digital communications. Second is the ability of individual groups to project power in ways that they weren't able to in the past, using clusters of technologies, everything from simple drones, again, to the potential for and strong interest in things like synthetic biology. And then finally, simple forms of systems integration between different technologies. So those three things, mobilization and power projection and systems integration, you used to have a national army in order to carry off. And what we're seeing now is that individuals and small groups and private armies, all of them can project power, mobilize, and integrate their systems in unprecedented ways.
So essentially what you're saying is never before have so many possessed the means to be so lethal, this diffusion of technology. And I wanted to throw that question to Dr. Wilson. I mean, in your book, you talk, I think, about attacks as well. Heads of state going to the opera, getting attacked, having the ability to be vulnerable, the theater, so to speak, the space of attacks, where every space becomes open. You can kill strangers out there. Anyone can have the technology and the means. You have the technology of the propaganda of the deed is everywhere. So is this something really new, or has this been around for some time? Anyone with a knife and a grudge can carry out the terror attack, and that's as old as 1,000 years ago. So why is it so specifically new and modern?
Thank you. I think, as Professor Cronin has said, yes. In many ways, we're seeing a sort of rebirth and a rejuvenation of a very 19th century idea of propaganda of the deed, the idea that demonstrative violence can create a resonant effect, an inspiring effect in the watching masses. I think the general point I would make is that all attention, all power in the modern world, contemporary world, depends upon the ability to pull the attentions of mass, or pull the tides of mass attention one's way. That's celebrity, that's advertising, that's all kind of basic politics and commercial marketing. But it's also terrorism. So from that point of view, I think it can be a kind of more helpful way to look at this as not to see terrorism as somehow something aberrational to contemporary society, but in many ways a very disturbing mirror of an extreme expression of some of its more dark tendencies. Is it entirely new? No, the roots are deep, but I think scale and speed and volume of communication massively matter, because they change the nature of the phenomenon. And as I've already perhaps indicated that they incentivize experimentation in some rather horrible and creative ways that do succeed in grabbing attention. We don't want to look, but we do, and we are fascinated by it.
But I wanted to, come to a common thread. I mean, we do see the diffusion of the technologies, and this changes the way political violence is carried out, because you have what is available and you begin to adapt. But what is interesting is that terrorists are going low tech. They're adapting and changing their modus operandi to get around, counter-terrorist techniques. Traditional forms of attack, as we become more dependent on digitalized services, the internet, terrorists keep pace, and they will constantly evolve their tactics. They can choose to go high tech or low tech. They can exploit the technology either way. But again, we have situations where you saw in New Zealand, someone goes in, gets a knife, and carries out an attack. They have lesser known explosives. They have alternative funding sources. So it is really a very dynamic picture. It's not, I would say, something so static, and they could scale up or scale down, as it were. Can I get your views on that, Professor Cronin? Since you've studied this in a very sort of horizontal perspective over the last 150 years.
Sure. I couldn't agree with you more, Ambassador. I think that it's a broader menu of things available. And also, as Dr. Wilson was saying, much greater capacity to learn from what other people are doing and to become fascinated by attacks that happen elsewhere. One of the things that I find particularly alarming, for example, when we talk about the evolution of the threat of terrorism, even in the last 5 years, one of the things I find surprising and alarming is the degree to which, for example, the right-wing threat in many European, Scandinavian, and in the United States, in these countries, has resurged. But there's an intersection now between right-wing groups, be they racist, anti-government, extreme nationalists. They have lots of different ideologies. They're coalescing on the desire to engage in violence, and they're mimicking, and even in some cases, posting tremendous admiration about what they call jihadist terrorist groups. So Islamist groups and the techniques that they have used over the last 20 years are now becoming attractive to groups that used to be considered, anomalous, or at least at great odds with Islamist groups. And so what they're intersecting on is the actual technology and the means themselves, rather than what we used to focus on in terrorism, which was motivations and ideologies much more. So this movement toward lots of ranges of different means and technologies is complementary with a change in a desire to take action in ways that gather attention, rather than focus specifically on individual ideologies.
So what would you say then is the target? In fact, I'll throw this to Dr. Wilson as well. I think you talked about states, and many of the attacks have been carried out against the people. I think this is in your book. After the 2005 attacks in London, one of the victims said that it's not the state that's being affected, but people are being ripped apart. And the techniques and tools that are being used to send a message to the state or to the people.
Thank you. I think it's both. And I think this is really one of the most puzzling features of contemporary terrorism, that we somehow, through familiarity, don't interrogate enough. One cannot catch a metro train or get on a plane without being reminded that total strangers might slaughter one. And I think our ancestors would have found that an extremely odd idea. We're so conditioned to sort of expect it through security announcements and so on, that we perhaps don't interrogate it enough. So, I think the point about this type of violence is its impersonality. The specific victims don't matter. That's an old observation of theorists of terrorism going back several decades, but I think it does hold true. They really are sort of just, if you'll forgive the crudity of the expression, they're just meat cashed in for free publicity. And that is what I think is so shocking about it. There's a quality of what the writer Joseph Conrad once called, blood-stained inanity about this type of terrorism, or as the Alex Schmidt, a distinguished theorist of terrorism, said, there's something absurd about terrorism. The slaughter that is created is real and immediate and harrowing in its effects. The better world the terrorists want is an uncertain gamble on the future. So there is something kind of just disproportionately and impersonally shocking about these type of tactics. But they work to the extent that they do get attention, and as I've tried to say, that is the kind of basis of all power in the modern world. It's also, as Professor Cronin was just wisely saying, in some ways the internet age has been called the era of universal comparison. Our horizons are much broader than they were, and this promiscuous borrowing of tactics across ideological divides is, I think, one of the really sort of odd and disturbing features of the 21st century that wasn't really there to the same degree even in the final decades of the 20th century.
But wouldn't you say, Professor Cronin, that there's always been borrowing of techniques and tactics? When you look at the early part of the 20th century, you had Irish nationalists sharing with Indian nationalist techniques You had different groups, the Russians sharing again with the Irish and the Indians. So there are different movements, but there's always been the sharing of techniques. And certainly you made a good point about Anders Breivik of Norway, basically in his own manifesto, admiring certain parts of what Al-Qaeda did, even though he's broadly speaking, a right-wing terrorist. So there's always been the sharing of techniques because this is the instrumental, I would say, value of doing so. So what has changed today in that sort of like a convergence or sharing between what should be disparate ideologies?
Well, you're absolutely right that contagion is a very old phenomenon, and it's been studied in depth, especially in the 20th century. So the two cases that are most thoroughly researched are contagion of airline hijackings in the 1970s and late 60s, and then also the contagion of suicide terrorism, and well before that, the contagion of the desire to commit suicide through newspaper publication. So those two things, the spread of particular types of techniques of, using lethal force against oneself or against others, that's not new at all. But what Dr. Wilson was saying about the speed, the scale, the scope, all of that matters tremendously. And, remember that when you have the capacity instantaneously to get on the web, to get onto social media, and you also have algorithms that are promoting certain types of activity, as soon as there's a tremendous amount of attention to something, it becomes even more attention grabbing. And our countermeasures are way behind when it comes to trying to dampen the interest, even if it's a horrified interest in an attack. We have extremely primitive tools, and we've not really been learning effectively from the best research into how platforms, as we know from recent revelations, platforms like Facebook already scale up the ability to gain information about violence, sometimes unwittingly. So, we need to develop better countermeasures to the scale, scope, and speed of our digital communications to begin with. And I don't mean crushing people's ability to participate in free expression. That is absolutely not what I think is the answer, but having better countermeasures beyond individual content moderation, for example, which is way too far behind. You've got individual human beings who are trying to catch this material, and it isn't fast enough by any means. The scale, scope, and speed are well beyond all of that. So building tweaks in the algorithms, there are good technological answers, but they go against profit models, and that's a huge problem.
So you have these super empowered individuals, and to just bring power is flowing to the people, enabling them to use technologies for good or for not so good ends. And the way Dr. Wilson sees it is this power that's flowing to the people that's used for bad ends up making a lot of, you can kill strangers, you can go to the public space, and you're basically create an air of vulnerability. And our countermeasures are not keeping up. And our countermeasures are way behind. But we do have the tools. We have artificial intelligence. We have what many people talk about as intrusive surveillance technologies. We do have the technology if we want to use it. And you have Dr. Wilson, not far from where you are, in London, is perhaps one of the most surveilled in terms of CCTV cameras. You have all sorts of technologies. Why isn't the technology catching up? In terms of countermeasures? Is this because of fears of human rights, because of democracies, because of the way they operate, and this is being exploited by these terrorists?
Thank you. No, that's an excellent question. I think part of the question is, part of the answer is, as Professor Cronin said, that in many ways the sort of bad experimentation outruns attempts to monitor it. I think in terms of, you're right, the centre of London is notoriously heavily surveyed. And to some extent that does work. If you actually look at response times to attacks at the London Borough Market, just south of the river on 2017, they're incredibly quick. There are armed police there very, very quickly indeed. But, it's a commonplace observation of terrorism and crime, actually more generally, that target hardening tends to diffuse attack patterns more widely. So yes, I'm speaking to you now, not so far from London, but I'm actually closer to Reading. We had a stabbing in the park there last year, which was a sort of apparently an Islamist attack. Very unusual location, not what I think of as one of the main stages. I think, one of the arguments for killing strangers is that, this type of political violence that was designed to shock used to take place on the main stages of the world. In other words, capital cities, as you've already mentioned, world leaders going to the opera. It was kind of relatively predictable, the kind of occasions and locations where this sort of violence would take place. Now it seems to be becoming much more diffuse in ways that are more unpredictable and certainly harder to contain. So it's not that the technology is just entirely left behind. It is molding the behavior, but some of the consequences are in turn hard to manage.
So actually, that's a very interesting point, this in terms of diffusion. And I want to bring this back to Professor Cronin, this so-called suburbing of terrorism. The fact is today, with anyone with a computer who can download information, and under the conditions of the pandemic, their theater becomes their backyard, their suburb, or their exurbs, and then you can carry it out because you can still rely on the media or social media to carry this. So this is again a form of adaptation, would you say?
Oh, I think you're bringing up the pandemic is an excellent point, and it's crucial to understanding how much more impact our digital technologies are having on individuals. So I completely agree with you, Ambassador. But remember that the technology that we have no insight into, and frankly, I don't want much more insight into it, is the human mind. So if you have people who are engaging in terrorism with no other record and no other way to give sort of predictive ability as to their behavior, this is more and more becoming the case, I believe, you're not going to be able to prevent especially localized and smaller scale terrorist attacks. That's something that we're going to have to learn to live with more than we have perhaps in past decades. Although I have to say that in the United States, the number of terrorist attacks in the 1970s per year was much, much greater than it has been since September 11th. So some of this is a matter of perception and learning and becoming more mature in our attitudes towards terrorism. That doesn't mean that I come away from my belief or pull away from my belief that there are more technological means that can potentially make terrorism more deadly in the future. But right now, the level of local diffuse knife attacks, vehicle attacks, those kinds of ordinary types of technologies, we have to become accustomed to those because we don't want the kind of control of the strong state that Dr. Wilson was mentioning that prevents individual liberty to the degree that there would be no terrorism. That could be absolutely repressive. And that leads to a kind of an authoritarian environment. So just to sum up, I would say that what's happened is terrorism has always had three sides in the triangle, if you will. I mean, there's always been, the terrorist and then the target. But the third side, the audience, that has become enormous. From having been a kind of a small pinpoint to the little triangle I draw in my mind, it has become a large series of different audiences. And members of those audiences can be more or less vulnerable to terrorism and radicalization and recruitment. And if you have a scale of millions and billions of people, you're going to find the anomalous 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 who are going to be attracted to that type of violence. And you simply can't predict the various types of audiences that are watching.
No, actually, that is a crucial point. And I think we've always talked in the years past, since 9/11, about Islamist, terrorist, jihadi threat, and as a key concern. And I think the work that the Sufan group has been doing has been interesting in highlighting about the far-right terror threat as a global problem. Because far-right extremism can still propel at-risk individuals towards violent radicalism. And you talk about the audience. We don't know where at-risk individuals are. In my country, Singapore, we've had 17-year-old Hindus who've basically been inspired by right-wing attacks in New Zealand to carry out knife attacks. And I take your point that in the US, in the 20 years since 9/11, far-right extremists, kill more people in the US than did American-based jihadis. So I think the key question, though, is if we are looking at far-right terror, and this is something that can be anonymized, and this is something that can happen in the suburbs, and this is something that can happen with the most low-tech tools, how again can we prevent this from happening without, I hesitate to use the word more authoritarian, but having stricter surveillance techniques that may sometimes have to put what is traditionally known as, you put security before rights, so to speak. Do you see that as legitimate, or would you see that as a problem? Professor, Dr. Wilson or Professor Cronin?
I guess I'll take the bait. It's, of course, it is one of the central dilemmas. I mean, I would echo what's been said before, is we don't welcome a police state. It's not worth sacrificing liberties for everyone to try and contain this problem. And that is an extraordinarily difficult message in any democratic society anyway to try and plead. If you stand in front of TV cameras and say, look, we've got to learn to live with this and tolerate it, you can be sure you'll be hammered from all sides. But I think it is unfortunately the message we have to sort of try and get through, because I think it is the only realistic response. It's no comfort to those directly affected. Of course it isn't. But this isn't an existential threat to civilization unless we make it so. So that is the first thing I would say. I would also, though, echo what's already been, I think, indicated, which is we just need a far more sophisticated digital response. And that will lead to some, and is already leading to some very awkward conversations. It will challenge the profit motives and the business model of all kinds of tech firms out there, and the giants, the Facebooks, the Twitters, and so on and so forth. But it will also, I think, have some awkward political resonances, perhaps particularly in the US with the constitutional freedoms on free speech, which have very admirable in many ways, but I think do become a real battleground in these kind of issues. The sort of thing I'm thinking of is how can we, in subtle ways, dismantle the learning culture that exists on, say, the far right, in which the internet really functions as an academy for how to conduct, say, a large-scale massacre better. If one looks at the more competent mass shooters of whatever ideological persuasion, but perhaps particularly noteworthy on the far right at the moment, but not just, it's clear there's a sort of form of institutional learning. They learn from each other. They learn to corral victims. They learn techniques that basically lead to higher death tolls. Are there ways in which we can think and, if necessary, intervene on how these kinds of incidents are reported? Because there is clearly a sort of longer term effect that is deeply disturbing. When Breivik conducted his massacre nearly 10 years ago, it was utterly aberrational, but we've seen plenty of pretty much near imitations since.
So in fact, that's actually leads me to the question of, if we have to put in perspective, you don't want to essentially, put this in perspective, the threat of terror. And I think the pandemic itself has put a lot of things into perspective for us, because just living under pandemic, and you've had the suspension of what, especially in the West, has been the suspension of individual rights in favor of safe management measures, in favor of wearing masks for public health reasons. So if we can do certain things for the protection of public health, and of course you see the pushback, there is also, in a way, a comparison of doing certain things or tolerating certain things for the sake of counterterrorism security. So where does one draw the line is something that's very dynamic and depends on the society, depends on its governance model, depends on the scale of the threat, and I would say, if you look at the West for now, I think there seems to be a much lower threshold for social control against public health measures, against counterterrorism measures. But does that make them more vulnerable or resilient as a society? I'm not sure. Professor Cronin?
Yes, all very, very good points. I would say that we have to find a viable model for democracy in the digital age that balances the various interests that people have and the relationship between security and civil liberties. But I don't think it's just a two-part relationship. For example, I think that the framing of much of digital communications strictly as freedom of speech is overdone in most of the English, especially the American discussions about the future of digital communications and social media. I think a lot of what we're looking at is not necessarily freedom of speech. Some of it is freedom against search and seizure because information is being collected. We need to start looking at data as being a national security priority, not just as something that can be collected by companies. The Europeans are ahead of us with respect to the GDPR, but there are lots of other things that we need to begin to build into our regulations, into the model for democracies that can be between authoritarian surveillance states and the whole suite of surveillance that includes, not just cameras, but all kinds of online surveillance. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a kind of a dangerous, violent, well, I would call it anarchy, I guess, but only in the loose sense of the term. But the relationship to anarchy is not accidental, because the last time we had to make these sorts of decisions was at the end of the 19th century, when you had a similar huge growth in sensationalized newspaper coverage of dynamitings and other kinds of terrorist attacks. And as you got into the 20th century, you had more development of editorial standards on the part of newspapers. You had self-restraint. You had far more professionalism of the press that, at least in most places, that actually tamped down the incentives for carrying out terrorist attacks to begin with. So it was a key element in reduction of violence in the early 20th century. We can do similar things now with our digital communications and with our tech companies. We just haven't built up enough political momentum yet. I think it's happening now, but we also have to make sure that the consumers who are using our tech platforms are much more aware of what the dangers are. And with the recent revelations of Facebook, the whistleblower who came out with thousands of pages of information about research on the harmful effects of platforms like Facebook and other platforms, I think people are becoming much more aware. So I'm actually very optimistic, because I think we're at the cusp now where we can begin to develop much more responsible technological digital communications. And I think that there are a lot of really smart people working on this problem, looking at regulations, teaching about it. I send a lot of my students to work for Congress, for example, and I think people in Congress are getting a lot smarter in the United States about how to talk about and deal with potential regulation of tech companies. There are a lot of other measures that we could put in place.
Thank you very much. No, I mean, certainly your point's well taken. I think there needs to be, the international community needs to work together. Governments should figure out the best way to partner platform providers and technology industry. If their profit model helps terrorist groups exploit social media to instill fear, radicalize vulnerable youths, and undermine security forces, I mean, that just is not sustainable. That has to change. And the platform providers must have, if they don't see the incentive, then they must see that there is going to be a cost to their profit model in terms of overall security. But the problem still is identifying and blocking online extremist content, misinformation and disinformation, because again, we come back down on the old age question of defining a terrorist, defining what is political violence, as opposed to something which is seen as a truly viable cause, political cause. And Dr. Wilson, do you have anything to say on that? Or do we square back to the problem of definition of terrorism and making it very hard to sort of figure out where do we draw the line?
Well, I always rather like the line of a sort of veteran academic commentator on terrorism, Brian Jenkins, which he said, that debates over definitions of terrorism were the Bermuda Triangle of definition of terrorism studies. It's seen entire conferences disappear into it and never re-emerge again. I think one has to accept we're talking about a political phenomenon. This is political violence, whatever else we might think it is or isn't. And there's going to be different interests, and the idea that if one just tries hard enough, is going to get that consensus. We would have done so at the UN or whatever high-level forum before now. But that doesn't mean that there aren't very useful precedents, perhaps in a more piecemeal and messy way, that perhaps are more technique-focused, that can make an enormous progress. If one looks at, say, the history of anti-hijacking conventions in the 1970s, there was pretty obviously, and soon became clear that there was never going to be any kind of consensus on the floor of the UN General Assembly as to how to define terrorism. But there was actually remarkably effective and quick progress made within a decade or so about how actually countries would handle aircraft hijackings in a way that really meant that they were pretty much tamped down, certainly by the 80s, the sort of shift from hijackings to bombings. I don't mean that airline security disappeared off the radar, and clearly 9/11 shows it didn't, but there was enormous progress made with that, and that, perhaps piecemeal and messy as it sounds, that seems to me a much more viable way to cooperate.
But in terms of social media, it's much more intangible, much more difficult, as it were, to sort of develop standards, to find ways to, if we want to use artificial intelligence, for example, to counter terrorism, you need to find a right platform. You need to sort of work together with many of these social media companies, these technology platforms. You can't just use it on its own. And I think these companies will have to cooperate. They will have to give up user data if necessary. Obviously, terrorists can work around this. We all remember the story of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State terrorists playing with their PlayStation and sending messages based on through PlayStation. So there are always ways around it, but I think there is, as long as information is shared across borders and on certain platforms, and getting to that data. And Professor Cronin, you talked a little bit about data protection, but we still, enforcement agencies, in trying to disrupt these terror groups, they still need to get to this data. And you have social media companies and gaming companies who want to hold on to this data, or at least, make sure that they're seen to be safe havens for this data. How do you balance that out at the end of the day? And there's some analogs to terrorist financing and, in certain countries as well. So how do we get around that, to get this data in a way that's effective?
Well, that's a very big, gnarly problem, and different countries treat data differently. Different parts of the world are interested in collecting data for their own state use. Artificial intelligence is really only as good as the data on which it learns or from which it draws conclusions. And if we don't have those who are keeping data, for example, on social media, willing to release enough data so that artificial intelligence can be smart enough to be able to respond well, then we're in a kind of a dead end. We're in a cul-de-sac. But I really do see a lot of promise going forward, particularly with revelations, like recently, the testimony by Frances Haugen here recently in the United States, giving lots of information about research that has been done by those who know their platforms much better than those of us on the outside. One of the problems has been that researchers have not always been able to get the kind of data that they needed or the kind of information that they needed from social media and other platforms to be able to come to strong conclusions. And yet what we know is that companies like Facebook are doing excellent work on their own impact on individuals, for example, young, vulnerable teenage girls, and they know what that impact is, how negative it is on those vulnerable kids. And with the release of that research, we have much more insight into the people who know and the people who can actually judge what the effects of their own actions are.
So, Dr. Wilson, would you say that if we want to stop the move to make it easier to kill strangers and terrorize communities everywhere, part of the battle lies in the whole infosphere, an Islamic State terrorist or right-wing terrorist who goes on a chat bot to sort of recruit or mobilize or spread fake news is basically part of that, I would say, infosphere, but which is now virtual and has real world impact and vice versa. How do we manage that to keep strangers from being killed?
Thanks. I mean, I think, yes, of course, this is kind of, a major headache. I think, though, we do need to be wise about the number of wannabes and hangers-on and useful idiots who these kind of internet subcultures attract. And this is one of the differences, I think, between, say, 1970s more cellular-based terrorism, that not everyone flirting with the rhetoric of these movements is going to do anything. And a more intelligent strategy might be to sort of try and wean some of them away in ways that, far cleverer minds than mine and far more technological savvy people than I could aspire to be, may come up with good suggestions of how that can be done. I think there will have to be more access to data to some degree, and that's going to be clearly a major battlefield. So the infosphere is, a very major part of that. I think, though, while we're talking about powerful vested interests that need to change, I'd say a couple of things. I actually share Professor Cronin's long-term optimism. I think societies do adapt or can adapt if they're wisely led. I think if one looks at the massive resistance in the airline and travel industry in the early 70s towards security measures, which you now take entirely for granted, cumbersome as they may be, things can shift if there is the political will. And let's not forget that there's been major connivance by political elites. I'm most familiar with Western examples, but one could look at Dirty in the Philippines or whatever, that in exactly this kind of post-truth society, when one looks at some of the wilder comments being bandied around in the Brexit debate in my own country, if one looks at the sheer recklessness of the Trump administration, this has been encouraged from the top down, and we shouldn't forget or overlook that, and that it can also be changed. So I think there's a major a parallel project of political education of both elites and national assemblies and publics as well.
Well, on that note, it's a very sensitive issue, but I think it would be important to at least address it. How far do you see terror groups evolving based on state support, on being used as tools of state policy? And therefore, in this sense, having the cover and having the support to be able to sort of like elude counterterrorism or policing. And is that in your respective sort of analysis in terms of the evolution of terror groups, is that a major factor? And is that grounds for optimism or pessimism there? Professor Cronin?
Well, state sponsorship of terrorism, of course, is an old phenomenon and very important. And we have, as Dr. Wilson was saying, stronger states than we've had in prior centuries. So there's no question, particularly since there's such ambiguity about the line between state and non-state when it comes to many of our digital communications platforms. There's already a kind of state sponsorship of at a minimum, misinformation and disinformation. When you look at the sort of gray actors that are between state and non-state, is the Internet Institute in Russia a state actor or a non-state actor? It's becoming more and more difficult to see a straight, bright line between state and non-state in many respects. So that is a huge problem. I would also, though, like to add that it's not just a question with respect to our technology of communications. It's also, in some cases, gadgets and hard technologies that we're developing or technologies that don't go naturally into our communications field, but exploit it for other purposes. So when you have live streaming online, for example, the fact that we have quadcopters that are strong enough and capable of carrying cameras and can do reconnaissance, as happened before the 2019 tragic mosque shootings in Christchurch, and has also happened in the United States with the neo-Nazi group Atomwaffen. So, the ability of groups to use these, somewhat ordinary consumer technologies that we don't have sufficient countermeasures against, we don't have sufficient controls against. I think that's another thing that we should be talking about. The physical technologies that are also having a much broader attack surface to be able to access people through the Internet of Things. So you've got so many devices that are connected to the Internet that gives us countermeasure capability, but it also gives the ability to engage in attacks. So it's extraordinarily complicated, the number of different kinds of regulatory and self-restraint and consumer responses that we need toward our digital technologies that are increasing at huge scale and scope. But we can also get ahead of the curve by building in security as we develop new technologies in ways that we haven't been doing thus far.
But I think that's part of the issue, isn't it? You raised some good points, but the whole regulatory morass is based on national jurisdictions. Globally, we're still facing difficulties working out a convention on cybercrime, on cybersecurity. All this is still works in progress. And in the meantime, it's not the right-wing terror groups, it's jihadis. And let's not also forget global narcotics groups, global crime syndicates, from whom they can also learn from each other techniques. I mean, you have global drug syndicates that build their own submarines, and use it for conveyance of drugs. It could be used for conveyance of operatives, whatever they want. So all of this makes it very difficult because we put things in neat buckets. But if I'm a jihadi, a terrorist, right-wing extremist, I'm basically going to find out where are the gaps in the system. So that's really a wicked problem. As you say, it's a gnarly problem which we really can't deal with quite so easily. Dr. Wilson, any insights from your own research into this, into how we can sort of like find ways to say, look, to build up our countermeasures and build up our resilience against these groups coming together or exploiting the loopholes?
Thank you. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of these kind of violent security challenges from small rebel groups or perhaps international criminals they're a phenomenon of the seams, they're a phenomenon of the cracks, and they will tend to seek out those gaps where national bureaucracies of whatever sort, be they security or intelligence or whatever, overlap or perhaps more accurately don't overlap, where there are kind of communication failures. So I think we should be entirely alert and expect that. And I think that just takes constant maintenance and periodic revamping of these kind of structures. But we should expect it. I mean, I think that's the point is that we shouldn't be surprised by it in a sort of way that we have tended to be. And I think much of my message is really about keeping things in proportion. This isn't a hopeless set of challenges. They can be managed in many ways. States are stronger in many parts of the world than they have been before. And I think in some ways we're a prisoner of our own expectations because at least in some of the richer parts of the world, we have had a good run since the end of the Cold War at least until the 21st century. Things seemed really quite prosperous and stable on many levels. And I think because of that, we tend to easily overreact to the awful things that do happen that aren't actually system threatening. It's a sort of, I often get a kind of surprise reaction from my master's students when they join us as saying, worry about nuclear weapons, worry about climate change. That's an existential threat. What we're going to be studying isn't. And it's not quite what they expected a director of terrorism studies center to say, but this stuff is serious, but we need to keep different scales of analysis in view at the same time. The kind of terrorist attacks we've been discussing over the last hour, obviously life-changing or life-ending for those directly affected, but at a society-wide and a global-wide scale, let's not lose the head. As you've already yourself wisely said, pandemics are a far greater threat, and in some ways have actually been a useful reality check for all of the nasty spin-offs and threats that they themselves have also spawned.
No, thank you for that important reality check. We've got a couple more minutes, and I just wanted to, before we close, ask each of you to highlight what you think has been the most significant evolutionary trend, or the most important thing of terrorism in the time that you've studied it, and what you think will possibly be the most significant future evolutionary trend, if you can, of terrorist groups. And then I'll start with Professor Cronin and then Dr. Wilson.
Well, I'm not going to be all that different from some of the things I've been saying in answer to this question, because I believe that the role of technology in terrorism has been understudied. There's been a tendency to just assume that everything from the past, that we're going to use guns and bombs and small techniques in a way that I think we're likely to find changing moving forward, not in dramatic ways, but in evolutionary ways, and we can predict them. So I think that that is one of the most important things that I've seen changing in recent years and also will change in the future. But I would like to end on an optimistic note, which is that you can study history and see how we have responded to similar problems. For example, the huge wave of terrorism that happened at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, putting aside, of course, the two world wars, but the threat of terrorism itself was one of the reasons why there was the establishment of European cooperation in policing. So Interpol and the ability of states to work together, in other words, to solve these kinds of problems is well established. And we had states working together to solve the problem of counterterrorism financing. We had intelligence cooperation. We've had a tremendous amount of innovation in state cooperation with respect to terrorism, and we need to do the same thing moving forward.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Cronin. Dr. Wilson?
Thank you. I'm always tempted to say as a historian that I don't do the present or the future, but I guess I'm professionally obliged here. And of course, I do have views. I think in the present, I think one of the kind of worrying trends is this diffusion that I've mentioned, and also the sort of, it's not just a diffusion of attack patterns and techniques and experimentation, but bizarrely the sort of causes that people adapt. I mean, the so-called incel or involuntary celibate movement of horrendously self-pitying men who can't have a romantic relationship with women, and sort of, in some ways, the ideas and assumptions behind that are as old as the hills. It's nothing new about misogyny, but turning it into a kind of organized political cause, as to some extent does show some signs of doing that. That surely is novel and highly disturbing. And I think, unfortunately, we'll see more of that going into the future. On the technological side, I mean, Professor Cronin is far more insightful on these things, but I think we're perhaps seeing a kind of bifurcation. I think we have to worry about the high-end stuff, the Internet of Things, and clever individuals, the sort of garden hobbyists or kind of workshop hobbyists that she's written about with such insight of what they will do with the high-end stuff. But in a sense, I think what is perhaps also fascinating is the danger of hybridity. I mean, it's often taking high-tech technology, but then often using it in quite a primitive way. I mean, it was a couple of years ago. It wasn't a terrorist attack, but it was a disturbing incident where in a Gatwick airport south of London was shut down for a couple of days by some idiot flying drones around, and they weren't apparently trying to kind of kill anyone, but I mean, the disruption was absolutely massive. So it was a kind of fairly, obviously drones didn't exist a few years ago, so at that level, it's kind of relatively sophisticated technology. It wasn't being used in a sort of sci-fi kind of incredibly sophisticated way, but the disruption was enormous, and more of that kind of experimentation, I feel we can expect to see.
Well, I think you both raised some very, very fascinating points from your respective fields of study. The technologies, the modus operandi, the way things operate. We've gone now 20 years since 9/11. We've certainly learned a lot more. There is grounds for optimism with the international community coming together to work together on whether it's terror financing or measures. But the fact is that terror groups remain, they're splintered, as you both pointed out. They've become more and more, I would say, commonplace, as it were. We must see the threat in its proper perspective, but they can still instill fear. They still know how to instill fear. I mean, it's a very human thing to be able to exploit psychologically. As you say, Professor Cronin, the human mind is a funny thing, but both the mind of the terrorists and the mind of the terrorized, you have vulnerable youth, you have at-risk individuals, you have security forces who can either over-calibrate or under-calibrate. So the problem is still with us. And I think if we want to talk about technology companies coming and working together with governments to ensure that the social fabric of our globalized community actually remains strong, I think we need to see far more global cooperation with these technology providers. And otherwise, we will continue to see terror groups evolve according to the logic of selective fitness and wreak their havoc. And one thing we haven't talked about, might be a discussion for a future item is if these groups decide to use bioweapons. I think the pandemic has shown how effectively you can use a virus and deploying it. So, I mean, again, to circle back to history, I think 600-700 years ago on the Black Sea, an invading army would throw over a body with the plague into a fort. And then that was that. So there's nothing new under the sun, but both your research has given us some very fascinating ideas, given us some wonderful perspectives. And for those of you who haven't yet got the two books, I would say I'm going to get my book, my copy of Professor Cronin's book, and as well Dr. Wilson's book. So Power to the People, Professor Cronin, and Killing Strangers, Dr. Wilson. And hopefully we will have more power to good people and less killing of strangers and more cooperation. Thank you very, very much, and really a pleasure. And I learned a great deal from talking to the two of you today. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.